This is the Pere Marquette 1223. You've probably already seen its younger sibling, the 1225. I'm Darren, and this is the Industrial Revolution. 1223 was built in November 1941 by Lima Locomotive Works in Lima, Ohio. It's a Pere Marquette Type N1 284 Berkshire steam locomotive with 69-inch 1753 millimeter drivers. 1223 can produce 2,979 horsepower and cruise up to 70 miles per hour or 113 kilometers per hour. With its tender, it's just over 101 feet or 31 meters long and nearly 16 feet or 5 meters tall. With a capacity of 22 tons of coal and 22,000 gallons or 83,000 liters of water, fully loaded, the locomotive and tender come in at just over 400 tons. And it needed all that coal and water. At cruising speed, 1223 would go through over 100 gallons, 375 liters of water per minute. That's a bit abstract, so how about this? It takes the average US citizen a full day to go through that much water. And yes, that even includes things like watering the grass. To boil all that water and get steam pressure up to 245 psi, the Berkshires used a huge 90 square foot, 8.5 square meter firebox to burn through over 100 pounds or 45 kilograms of coal every minute. No one can actually shovel that much coal, so 1223 used a steam-powered mechanical stoker. The fireman, once the fire is actually lit and the boiler up to pressure, controls the mechanical stoker to operate a long auger running the length of the tender to feed coal into the firebox, instead of actually having to shovel it all by hand. If you do the math, the water supply will take 1223 from either Detroit or Chicago to Grand Rapids, Michigan, but no further. Interestingly, that didn't actually create any problems. The Berkshires were the biggest, most powerful steam locomotives on the Pere Marquette lines. Pere Marquette bought them for heavy, fast freight service. Although they had lines running throughout Michigan, because the Berkshires were so heavy, they're pretty limited in terms of where they were allowed to run. The only tracks they had which could support the Berkshires were running from Toledo, Ohio, north through Detroit, and on north to Flint and into Saginaw. And another line from Detroit running west through Grand Rapids, then south around Lake Michigan into Chicago. With a total weight of 220 tons and a per axle weight on the drivers of 35 tons each, the other routes just weren't built to handle that weight. For 1223, the premier route was the overnighter. At a time before interstate highways, the 9.5-hour trip between Detroit and Chicago was the fastest way to move cargo, way faster and far more reliable than trucks. The eastbound overnighter, train number 40, would leave Chicago to Detroit via Grand Rapids. Upon arrival at the Wyoming Yard in Grand Rapids, the locomotive would be cut from the train and a newly serviced locomotive swapped in. Due to division rules, the eastbound crew, coming out of Chicago, operating in the Chicago division, would also get off the train. They weren't allowed to go into the Eastern Division, which was creatively called the Detroit Division. A new crew would take the train east on into Detroit. In the ideal world, the westbound train, number 41, which left Detroit earlier, would arrive in Grand Rapids at the same time. Both locomotives would get swapped out for newly serviced ones, crews would swap trains, and just go back home. Unfortunately, it wasn't always so smooth, and Pere Marquette didn't really want to delay the overnighter. So each night, they'd have 2 trains, 4 locomotives, and use somewhere between 2 and 4 full train crews. Of course, 1223 and its siblings and crews didn't get to just work 5-hour days. The locomotive would be serviced at the yard, likely taking an hour or 2, maybe longer, then to be assigned to the next heavy freight that needed to go out. If 1223 brought the overnighter into Detroit's Rougemere yard early morning, a few hours later, it might end up being sent down to Toledo to get a quick load of coal before coming back up to Detroit. After another quick servicing, it gets sent out on the overnighter again, or maybe up to Saginaw instead. It just depended on where it was needed and where all the other locomotives were in terms of upcoming service. While scheduling, they always had to keep in mind that some lines, like the overnighter, were high priority, and any other train would be delayed, if needed, to ensure that the high priority trains ran on time. So why was the overnighter so important? Remember, when 1223 began service, the US involvement in World War II was just getting started. Resources were limited, and rationing was starting to kick in. The eastbound overnighter carried raw materials, food, and other critical materials from the western half of the country into the entire Metro Detroit region. The western route, which started right next to the huge Ford Motor Company Rouge plant, collected the industrial output from southeast Michigan's massive industrial complex and sent it out to the western half of the country and into the Pacific. How important were railroads during this time? Throughout the war, the railroads were considered a critical war industry. First, of course, the military had an urgent need for skilled railroad workers to run the military railway service. They needed people who knew how to build, run, maintain, and repair boilers, locomotives, and other steam equipment, so the railroad labor forces were decimated. Despite recruiting thousands of women and teens into the railroad industry, trying to fill the gaps where they could, the military was still forced, from time to time, to discharge skilled railroad workers back to the industry just to keep the critical supply chain moving. With the end of the war, resources slowly became available again. Remember all that servicing I mentioned for heavy steam locomotives? Well, diesel-electric locomotives don't need that, and the railroads were finally able to get back to dieselization. Even the best diesel electrics in the late 40s and early 50s couldn't match the power of the Superpower big steam locomotives like the Berkshires. General Motors' electromotive division had a solution. Their multi-unit control system allowed a single train crew to operate several diesel-electric locomotives together, matching or even surpassing the power of the most powerful steam locomotives of the day. These incredible steam locomotives were doing a great job, but the money was against them. With no need to stop for coal or water, with cheaper crews, with far less required maintenance, dieselization was the future. In 1951, 1223 was retired, and instead of being sent for scrap, as was the case with so many steam locomotives, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad, which had bought the Pere Marquette line in 1947, donated 1223 to the Michigan State Fairgrounds for display, where it happily stayed until 1980. That's when the State Fair wanted to expand and decided to evict 1223. I want to take a second to thank my Patreon and YouTube members who make it possible for me to come out and document and share our incredible heritage, helping to preserve it for the future. Members get monthly updates and insider videos to go behind the scenes of this work. You can join at patreon.com/industrialrevolution or here on YouTube. Thanks for your support. Now let's get back to the video. Fortunately, the city of Grand Haven, Michigan, and the West Michigan Railroad Historical Society teamed up to rescue 1223 for display in a park on the Grand Haven waterfront. After 3 decades sitting idle, 1223 took extensive work just to get the wheels rolling again. Just getting it to move at all took heavy lubrication and disconnecting the cylinders from the driver wheels. Finally, in August 1981, Chassis Systems and Grand Trunk Western Railroads hooked up to the 1223 and very, very slowly dragged it across the state. This train, sometimes called a hospital train for its role moving critically damaged equipment, crawled painfully slowly across the state, staying under 20 miles per hour, 30 kilometers per hour the whole way, and stopping a lot along the way to ensure the wheels were still turning and nothing was having problems. On September 1st, 1981, The locomotive, with extensive support of the 1436th Engineer Company, the Michigan National Guard, arrived in Grand Haven and began an extensive cosmetic restoration. You might think this is the end of the story, but it's not. Railroad preservation and restoration is never that simple. 2 hours east of here, in Owasso, Michigan, is the far more famous Pere Marquette 1225. Also retired in 1951 and originally put on display at Michigan State University, 1225, the inspiration and, believe it or not, one of the actual voice actors for the Polar Express movie, needed a lot of work to go from rusty display locomotive to fully functional excursion locomotive. It actually still takes a lot of work to keep it going today. Believe it or not, you can't just call up Lima Locomotive Works and get replacement parts anymore. Negotiations happened, but it wasn't easy. Restoration work and keeping a restored locomotive running isn't cheap. A lot of nonprofits, if they're lucky, operate on a shoestring budget. Many operate on even less. When broken or worn parts are found, volunteer labor can only take you just so far. At the same time, no one likes giving up good parts from your historic exhibits in exchange for broken ones. Still, for those parts that were either just way too expensive or way too complicated to fabricate, parts were generally swapped, one for one, moving a functional part from 1223 to 1225 and replacing it with a heavily worn or broken part from 1225. These parts have kept 1225 alive and running, keeping steam alive. For 1223, though, you could argue there's been some degradation. In terms of cosmetic restoration, there's been virtually no impact, but in terms of historic preservation, there's been a cost. In that sense, 1223 has paid the price to keep 1225 alive. With improvements in 3D scanning, 3D printing, CAD systems, etc., it's becoming cheaper and easier to duplicate some parts, but that doesn't mean it's become cheap or easy or necessarily even possible. A century ago, it was fairly easy to get a huge casting, like replacement driver wheels, but today, those are nearly impossible to make. Add in the Federal Railroad Administration's mandatory 1472-day boiler inspection, which was implemented as a direct result of the 1995 Gettysburg Railroad boiler explosion. This rule requires you to fully strip down everything out of the locomotive every 15 years. Hopefully, both trends, easier to fabricate parts and increased safety, continue, making it easier to keep our operating steam locomotives running safely and bringing more historic steam locomotives back into service, representing and sharing our incredible steam heritage. So although 1223 here only ran for about 10 years, it still made a huge impact in railroading and still is one of the best examples we have of the big steam era. And because of that, this is the Industrial Revolution. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. If you could help out the channel, I like, share, subscribe, and comment. I love reading the comments. Usually respond to those pretty quickly. I have a playlist here if you want to see more railroad videos. Also, YouTube thinks that video up there is one that you'll really like watching next. Again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.